Odoo is business management made so simple, a kid could explain it.
Sometimes business software can't talk to other programs. But Odoo, funny word, has every program from CRM to HR to accounting in one platform. It should cost a lot, but it doesn't. So you should use Odoo because they save you money.
Odoo makes a lot of sense, but doesn't cost a lot of sense. Sign up now at odoo.com.
That's ODOO.com.
Good job.
Thanks.
You've almost certainly been prescribed a medication before, but did you understand how it worked? The way your medication works in your body shouldn't be a mystery. Learn how Vyvgart Hytrulo, F-gartigimod alpha, and hyaluronidase QVFC works by visiting vyvgart.com/MOA. That's VYVGART.com/MOA. Brought to you by argenx.
I want to say hello to my new TikTok followers. I mentioned that I'm on TikTok on my last episode, and a bunch of you went and followed me, and I really appreciate that. I know it's not really true crime related. There are some true crime things, but not a ton. And it's really more my escape from the heaviness of life. So you're going to see more like my hot takes from Real Housewives episodes, what book I'm reading, sometimes what I cooked for dinner, that sort of thing. It's the type of content that is more fun for me to create than it is for others to consume, and that's okay. If you go check my pinned posts on TikTok, it's at CrimelineSCharlie, you're going to see an unboxing of a brew book and candle box. It's not a sponsorship, but a listener of mine is friends with the owner, and the owner sent me a box to check it out. And I wanted to mention it because I think it would be a really good gift idea. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about it. It's a monthly subscription box with a brew, meaning coffee or tea, a book that they have curated for the month, focusing on independent authors, and a scented candle. I'm going to leave their link in the show notes, and if you're on TikTok, you can check out the box I got this month, as well as all of my other amazing content. When Roy Murry came back from combat, he battled PTSD. He struggled to treat his physical and emotional trauma, and later his defense attorney would say this was used against him to railroad him for a crime he didn't commit. But the authorities are sure they got the right guy. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Crimelines. This episode was suggested by a listener who asked not to be named, but they hoped I would cover it because they think this is a wrongful conviction case that no one is paying attention to. They sent me an article by Edward Snook with the U.S. Observer about this case, and that's really the only reference I found to this being a case of wrongful conviction. So I did what I do, and I fired up the newspaper archives and Google.com and went through every article I could find, step by step, to build out what I could of what happened and the evidence. And my answer as to whether I think this is a wrongful conviction isn't entirely a yes or a no, but let's go ahead and get into the case so that I can share my thoughts at the end. The U.S. Observer article, as well as all of my sources, are linked in my show notes. Let's get started with the Constable family. We have Kelly and Lisa Constable, who had 3 children together. They had a daughter named Amanda, and then identical twin boys named Ryan and John. Lisa had grown up in the Seattle area, but she raised her kids in Colbert, Washington, which is about half an hour north of Spokane. It's a great place to raise kids, and they were all very active in the outdoors. John especially, being out in nature, became one of his passions. After the kids were a little older, Lisa started working as a massage therapist. And then in 2010, with all 3 kids mostly grown, the twins were about 18 at the time, Lisa and Kelly split up. Lisa moved out and started renting a house from a firefighter named Terry Canfield. The house wasn't too far away from the family home, maybe about 5 minutes, so Lisa and the twins were able to stay in the same area that they loved so much. At some point after Lisa had moved in, Terry realized she needed a little bit more help than just a place to rent. She needed help navigating not just her divorce proceedings, but life in general. Lisa had suffered some type of brain injury that made it difficult for her to be 100% fully independent. According to Terry, she had trouble with managing stress and anxiety, and also with processing complicated thoughts. So Terry, in addition to being a landlord, stepped up as a bit of an advocate for Lisa. And as the two spent more time together, they fell for each other and started dating. The court needed to, because of Lisa's neurological issues, make sure she was being properly protected. That contributed to this divorce taking longer than anticipated. I mean, we're looking at a divorce between two people who don't have minor children. It took about 2 years before this case was settled in June of 2012. Then in October of 2012, 4 months after the divorce, Terry and Lisa married. And then less than a year later, in August of 2013, the family celebrated yet another wedding. Lisa's daughter, Mandy, married her fiancé, Roy Murry, after about 3 or 4 years together. And Roy had a lot of things he was struggling with during their relationship, and I think it's important to go through his background a little bit so we can fully appreciate what was going on. Roy was an Iraqi war veteran, having served with the Army National Guard. He was injured after a bomb exploded, and he received a Purple Heart. And then he also received a Bronze Star for Valor because though he was injured himself, he kept on the mission of protecting others. Unfortunately, Roy's injuries were severe, both in the physical impact and the mental one, and he was discharged from the service. While he was recovering from his physical injuries, he was given opiate painkillers by his doctors. And as sometimes happens, he became addicted. So in addition to healing physically and with his PTSD, he now has added substance use disorder on top of it. According to the Department of Veteran Affairs, 1 in 3 veterans who seek treatment for substance use disorder also have post-traumatic stress disorder. And then if we look at it the other way, about 25% of vets with PTSD also have substance use disorder. The link between these is obvious. Of course, Roy, who had been injured in a combat zone and had to help save others, saw, heard, and smelled things few of us have ever experienced. And that prolonged heightened stress of being in a combat zone, plus the trauma of the actual incident, did lead to a diagnosis of PTSD. And these factors caused the breakdown of Roy's first marriage in 2008. Something his ex-wife later spoke about is a hallmark of PTSD, and that is hypervigilance. Roy would search their apartment weekly to look for, who knows what, hidden people, hidden devices, some type of hidden danger that only someone with hypervigilance would even be thinking about. And then Roy started turning to the one thing that quiets everyone's anxiety, and that is having a plan. This is a healthy coping mechanism for anxiety. I'm anxious about X, so what do I do if it happens? Except Roy's plans became extreme because his anxieties were extreme. His anxieties were about things like the apocalyptic downfall of government and widespread civil disorder and lawlessness. So that is what he was making a plan for. Eventually, Roy and his first wife divorced in 2008, and it was just a year or two later that he and Mandy started dating. And Mandy definitely noticed the same things about Roy that his first wife did. Like one time when he invited her to go camping and she expected it to be a regular camping trip like the ones her family would go on. But when they got there, it was like a survivalist camp. Another time he took her camping and it ended up being a 4-day prepper-level training encampment. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, Roy Murry trained with a Washington-based militia group, and he was the chief acquisition officer for a now-defunct company that he had named Patriot Enterprises LLC. It has been broadly described as a security and sales company that he had to supplement his benefits that he was getting from being an injured veteran. But more specifically, their work was in research and development of machined parts to serve the firearms industry. So Roy was involved in the broader prepper community, and as happens anytime you put yourself in an echo chamber like that, it only reinforced his beliefs. As for what Mandy's family thought about Roy, he did not make a great impression the first time they met, and that's because he got triggered, and I mean that in the true psychological meaning of the word, not a buzzword. The family was all hanging out and getting to know Roy for the first time when Lisa playfully pushed him with her foot. It wasn't like a kick, it was more like a nudge, maybe to make it like he was going to fall over. It was a joke. But Roy had a full-on trauma response. He felt threatened, so he put Lisa in a headlock to neutralize this perceived threat. It doesn't sound like he hurt her, but I'm sure it was very scary for her, seeing as Roy was like 6 feet 2 inches tall and military trained. I attend the True Crime Podcast Festival every year. It is in Boston in July this year if you want to go. This is not an advertisement for it, but what happens at that event is that a lot of victims and family members come. Because of that, they make an announcement at the start of the event asking that people be mindful of other people's trauma and ask before touching them, whether that is a hug, putting your arm around them in a picture, anything like that, you need to ask first because the True Crime Podcast Festival should be a space where people feel safe, especially since for most of the weekend they're probably sharing their trauma with people. But if you are not aware of someone's trauma or you don't have any education about being trauma-informed, you're not going to be thinking about this. And Lisa certainly did not mean any harm with Roy. She thought she was being friendly. So the family learned from the jump that things had to be different with Roy, and they got used to handling him with a bit of kid gloves, even if they weren't always comfortable with him. Like when he would start talking about the fall of the government or various conspiracy theories, those can be conversation stoppers when they're brought up at a family dinner, and it makes things a bit awkward. Like a lot of partners in situations like this, Mandy acted as a buffer between her family and Roy, managing everyone's expectations and softening the opinions in both directions. Another thing Mandy's family didn't love about Roy was that he carried a gun everywhere. They had their own guns. They were not anti-gun, but they weren't comfortable with Roy bringing his firearm into their house. So Roy respected their boundary when Terry and Lisa asked him not to bring his gun into their home anymore, but he did complain about it privately. Because Roy really did bring a gun everywhere, even in places where he shouldn't have had it. He ended up having legal issues come up in regards to this. Both of these issues were in 2011, while he and Mandy were still engaged. The first incident was in January of 2011 when Roy was in Las Vegas and he was parked on the side of the road. A patrol officer noticed the car at about 2 a.m. and it was at a strange angle, so he decided to go check it out. And he found Roy passed out, drooling from his mouth, and he had a little bit of trouble waking him up. Once the officer had Roy's attention, he asked about guns, and Roy disclosed that he had one in his trunk. But when they had him get out of the car and they patted him down, he had one in his waistband that he had not told the officer about, so he was arrested for carrying a concealed weapon. That was not Roy's version of events. He said that he was out picking up a prescription for his fiancée when he got lost. Due to the dry air in the desert, his eyes were irritated by his contacts. So he pulled over thinking he would close his eyes for a bit before getting back on the road, but he inadvertently fell asleep. Roy said that he did tell the officer about the gun on his hip and that it was not concealed. It was visible until he got out of the car and was ordered to put his hands on the vehicle. This caused his jacket to fall in a way that concealed the firearm. This is the type of charge that does not make it into the newspaper, so the only reason we know so much about this arrest was because Roy Murry was at the time in the running for a political appointment. What happened was Bob McCaslin Sr. had stepped down from his elected position in the Washington State Senate on January 5th, 2011. He had had a heart surgery that led to a number of complications, and though his seat was up for election in November, he was so ill that he opted to step down 10 months early. And that seems like the right call, as he died 2 months later, a month before his 85th birthday. Anyway, they needed to replace him, so the Republicans came up with their 3 nominees to be selected to fill the seat until the November election. They picked 1 experienced politician and 2 inexperienced ones, and Roy was one of the inexperienced ones. These nominations seemed rather calculated, as though the Republicans were trying to push through the guy they wanted by not really putting up any serious contenders. But that didn't mean the other 2, including Roy, didn't try their best to get the job. Roy's arrest in Las Vegas just a couple of weeks after he was named as a potential replacement for McCaslin made the news. He didn't let it stop him, though, and he stuck in there until they officially named someone else to the office in February. And because he had been a nominee, Roy's next arrest was also in the papers, even though it was a misdemeanor, and again, this is something that would normally not get any ink. In April of 2011, Roy went to the VA hospital in Walla Walla for a doctor's appointment, and he disclosed to his doctor that he carried a gun 24/7. They saw that there was a bulge in his pocket and called security. Like with other federal buildings, VA hospitals prohibit weapons, and Roy was carrying a 9mm Beretta and a knife with a blade longer than 3 inches. It made the papers when he was indicted the next month on these charges. As far as I can tell, these 2 incidents in January and April of 2011 are the only 2 charges he had for carrying his guns everywhere, and neither of them dissuaded Mandy from going ahead and marrying him. But all the issues from their dating life, of course, followed into their marriage. A complaint Roy had in Terry and Lisa's direction, particularly Lisa, was that he felt they were interfering in his and Mandy's lives and their relationship too much. I personally think, as a mom, that Lisa was just genuinely worried about her daughter being in a relationship with someone who had Roy's issues. It's not the PTSD that was necessarily the problem, but that Roy seemed to be leaning into it rather than trying to treat it. His hypervigilance had escalated into paranoia and conspiracy. And I don't mean second shooter on the grassy knoll conspiracy or shadow government conspiracy. I mean more extreme than that. Around 2013, Roy started talking about aliens coming to Earth and how the people we encounter day to day aren't fully people. Some of them are actually hybrids. He believed he was in contact and working with the CIA, and that the Russian equivalent of that was after him. On one trip Mandy and Roy took, Roy told Mandy that he had to pay attention to the traffic patterns because that's how someone was communicating with him. It got to where Mandy wasn't sure what he would do or believe next, and she didn't know where this was headed. She needed some space from Roy, and she asked him for a separation in late 2014, after less than a year and a half of marriage. Mandy moved out of their apartment in Lewiston, Idaho, and moved 2 hours north to live with her mom and stepdad. She found work as a nurse at a Spokane area hospital and started trying to get back on her feet. I'm sure living at home wasn't her first choice as a grown adult, but it was somewhere safe to land when she needed it. It sounds like Mandy was planning a divorce from the start, but she didn't know how to broach the subject with Roy. She was afraid to. Apparently, Roy kept a mental list of people who had wronged him and who he would target if the government ever collapsed and he could get away with it. Though Mandy never saw an actual physical list, she didn't want to end up as someone he perceived as having betrayed him because she wanted to avoid being on that list and being a target. Roy and Mandy remained in contact in the months after she left, and in April of 2015, Roy went up to Colbert to visit with Mandy. He told her that he had a job now, and it had something to do with aliens and Russians. He then went on to talk about how he could shapeshift into animals, and it seemed that during the time of their separation, Roy had only gone deeper into what Mandy believed were delusions. Today's episode is sponsored by newspapers.com, the largest online newspaper archive that I use in pretty much every episode of Crimelines I make. They have more than 1 billion pages from the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and beyond. If you are captivated by stories of the past, if you like to get in there and get all the little details of true crime cases as they developed, newspapers.com is basically a time machine for you. It provides unparalleled access to 3 centuries of history. You can dive into their extensive archives to experience history as it happened, looking at news, events, and even everyday moments that shaped the world around us. Because their search feature is so easy to use, you can filter your results by date, location, specific paper, category, and more. Newspapers.com has this great clipping feature, which makes it easy to save and share whatever you found. Come explore 1 billion pages and make infinite discoveries today on newspapers.com. Use the code CRIMELINES for an exclusive 20% discount on your subscription. Again, that is code CRIMELINES for an exclusive 20% discount. So here we are, another holiday season, and all those impossible to buy for gift people are still there. And I've got the perfect gift for you. Skylight Frame is a touchscreen digital photo frame that your whole family will love. Upload thousands of photos with your phone and watch them appear in seconds. The setup is so easy, it takes less than 60 seconds. The least tech-savvy person you know can handle this. But one of the best features that we use the most is the sharing aspect. It's not just me adding photos to the Skylight, it's the entire family, either through email or through the free Skylight mobile app with no subscription required. Everyone can send photos to my mother-in-law's Skylight frame. And probably her favorite feature, other than getting photos of the grandkids anytime she wants them, is that she can either heart to say thank you for the photo or she can remove it if she doesn't like it. Having control over what is being displayed in our home is very important, and they allow you to do that so easily with a touch screen. You swipe through photos, say goodbye to the ones you don't like, thank the person who sent them. And it just looks beautiful in your home. The photos are displayed in HD. And now, as a special limited time offer for my listeners, get $20 off your purchase of a Skylight frame when you go to skylightframe.com/crimelines. That's skylightframe.com/crimelines and get $20 off your purchase now at skylightframe.com/crimelines, and the link will be in the show notes. About a month later, on May 25th, 2015, Mandy and Roy talked again, and Mandy was a bit relieved when Roy brought up divorce. He said that he felt that there was a lack of trust in their relationship, and it wasn't something he could see them coming back from. Now, part of his lack of trust was that he believed Mandy and her mom Lisa were secret Russian agents, but Mandy was not going to argue the details at this point. Roy brought up the divorce, and she could simply agree to it and then move forward without being the bad guy in Roy's mind. Mandy said neither of them were heated during this conversation, and Mandy felt like things were about as amicable as they could be under the circumstances. They wrapped up the conversation in the late afternoon because Mandy had to go to work. Being that she worked the swing shift, Mandy would usually get home a bit after midnight, but that night, another nurse called out sick, so Mandy was asked if she would stay for an extra few hours to help out. She agreed, and she called her mom Lisa to let her know that she would be getting home later, clocking out around 3:30, so it would be closer to 4 before she got there. And while Mandy was working late, at 2 a.m., a neighbor of Terry and Lisa Canfield was checking on his livestock when he heard noises coming from the direction of the Canfield property. He saw flames and he called 911 to report it. Early reports say that the call came in as a suspected illegal slash burn. After the neighbor hung up with 911, he went over to the house to see what was going on, and he realized that the house and an outbuilding were both on fire. He tried to get into the house, but the doors were locked, so he just banged on the front door, hoping to wake up anyone who was sleeping inside, but no one answered. When Mandy got home around 4 a.m., they were still fighting this fire. Given that there were two separate fires, one of the house and one in the building out back, it was pretty obviously arson. Two separate buildings don't spontaneously combust at the same moment. And Mandy, when she arrived and saw this, she collapsed. She knew her mother, Lisa, stepfather, Terry, and brother, John, were all supposed to be home that night. She immediately told the police that she suspected her estranged husband, Roy Murry, was behind this, and she wasn't the only one to say that. A neighbor echoed her sentiments, calling Roy, quote, a psycho. Mandy explained to the police that she had talked to Roy that afternoon about getting a divorce, and that Roy had long blamed her family for meddling in their relationship. She could see him targeting them. If he took away her source of love and comfort, it would both punish her for leaving him and maybe even drive her back to him as she was seeking support. But until they entered the house, they couldn't confirm who, if anyone, had died in the fire. And it turned out that people had been killed, but no one died in the actual fire. As they entered the home, they first found 52-year-old Lisa Canfield's body at the end of her bed. She had been shot upwards of 12 times. They also noted that Lisa had defensive wounds on her as she bravely tried to defend herself. Lisa was remembered as someone who loved nature, riding horses, and just being outside. She was a protective mother with a giving heart. Near her body was a fireman's helmet, and it was assumed that one of the firefighters had dropped theirs. But it actually belonged to her husband, 59-year-old Terry Canfield, who had been a firefighter for many years, and he had a real passion for emergency medical services, both in rendering aid but also teaching others. He also had a sharp sense of humor, and he would do stand-up comedy under the name The Medic of Mirth. Terry was not found in the bedroom with Lisa. Instead, his body was found in the outbuilding that had been set on fire. He had been shot 5 times, and they could not tell if he had defensive wounds due to the damage from the fire. They had not been able to immediately access all of the house safely, so it wasn't until 10 in the morning that they were able to do a full walkthrough, and that's when they found the third body, 23-year-old John Constable. John had inherited his love of the outdoors from his mother, and he was working on his bachelor's degree in natural resources while working as a manager at a local restaurant. He had been shot 4 times, once to the back of the neck, then again in the temple, in the front of his neck, and in his chest. It was believed that after killing the 3, the perpetrator poured gasoline around and started the fire using road flares. The remains of gas caps and flares were found at the house, and it's also believed that the gasoline had been poured on or near the bodies because those areas had significantly more fire damage than the usual places like upholstered furniture and even hanging clothes. Obviously, the investigators wanted to talk to Roy, and so did Mandy. She called him around 4:30 in the morning, so not that long after she got to the house and figured out what was going on. Roy did not answer this call. She did talk to him on the phone at around 7:30, and he said he was in Lewiston, and cell records showed that his phone pinged off the tower in Lewiston for both of these phone calls, and Lewiston is 2 hours away. Another angle to look at is that maybe this wasn't Roy. Maybe this was a home invasion gone wrong. So Mandy told the police about valuable items in the house that would have been tempting to a thief. There were guns, silver coins, and about $3,000 in cash. And all of those things were found by investigators in the house untouched, except one. one gun was missing, and it was a handgun that Roy had given to Mandy that she took with her when she left. That gun, and only that gun, was gone. It seems strange that anyone, other than Roy, would pass up thousands of dollars in cash, valuable coins, and other firearms, but take that one specific gun. So obviously Roy was on the radar, and the detectives in Spokane County called down to the Lewiston police to ask them about him. They said they knew who Roy was, and they were also aware that he was anti-police. Though that might be simplifying things a bit, he was anti-government, and the police were just one cog in the machine. But the Lewiston police agreed to go out to Roy's apartment that morning to see if he was even there. They saw his vehicle parked, but when they knocked on the door, he didn't answer. They kept knocking, and eventually he did open the door. He was hesitant to speak to them, but when they did ask his basic whereabouts from the night before, he said he was home, but he did run to the grocery store in the early afternoon to grab a salad, and then he stopped at the smoke shop to buy vape juice, but other than that, he was at his apartment. He said he did notice that he missed a call from his estranged wife overnight and called her back, which is when he learned what had happened. He didn't say much else to the Lewiston police, but he did agree to meet with the Spokane County police to give a full statement. Then later that night, after the Lewiston police had spoken to Roy, a man in dark clothing was seen at the scene of the fire up in Spokane County. When the man realized he had been spotted, he took off on foot and he was chased. Though the deputies searched the area, they couldn't find the man, but he did vaguely fit Roy's description and size. He was tall and slim. They called the Lewiston police and asked them to check on Roy's whereabouts, so they went out to his apartment again. This time his car was gone, and he didn't answer the door when they knocked. When they later pulled Roy's cell phone records from that night, his phone was in Spokane, about 25 minutes from the scene. It didn't track him right to the house, but Roy didn't have an obvious reason to be up there otherwise. It does seem odd to me that he drove all the way up to the Spokane area because when Roy set up his interview with the police, they were offering to come down closer to him and meet him in Pullman rather than making him drive all the way up to Spokane County. But clearly he was willing to drive all the way up there, so they could have just met him there. This Pullman meeting didn't happen, though Roy called and canceled it, so they rescheduled, this time agreeing to meet in Spokane, but Roy then canceled that one too. So then they decided to meet in Pullman again, but you'll never guess, Roy called and canceled. They finally agreed on a fourth date, time, and location, and this time, he didn't cancel. They met with him in Moscow, Idaho. The detectives noticed some redness to Roy's face at this meeting. It looked kind of like an uneven sunburn. He also had some visible cuts, a cut to his hand, one to his left bicep, and one to his right arm. Now, Roy had explanations for those. One was a cut from a knife, and the others were probably from brush. But with signs that Lisa fought back against her attacker, we know that the investigators were suspicious. Something new that came up in this interview was Roy's alibi, an alibi he did not give to the Lewiston police. Roy said that on the night of the murders, he was not home all night, but rather he was camping with friends. Now that's great. This is an overnight alibi that they could corroborate, since it wasn't just an alibi that he was home sleeping alone. He was with people who could verify this, except Roy refused to name these friends. He claimed they were all in the intelligence community and wouldn't talk to the police even if he did give their names. As for the call from Mandy at 4:30 in the morning that he didn't answer, Roy said that he hadn't taken his phone camping with him, and he got home around sunrise, which is when he learned he missed her call. He would later slightly contradict this by saying he missed the call because he was sleeping, not because his phone wasn't with him. Roy actually sat for 2 interviews, one shortly after the murders and again on May 30th. For the ease of covering this case and his version of events cohesively, let's just get into what he said in both interviews. Roy told the authorities that he worked for the CIA and he wanted to discuss his theories about who the killer might be, but he wouldn't do it if they recorded it. To keep Roy talking, the investigators obliged and turned off the recording device. According to the investigators, Roy then said he suspected the Russian Federal Security Service, aka the FSB, was behind it. The FSB is what replaced the KGB after the fall of the Soviet Union. The reason the Russians might be involved was that they had attempted to recruit Roy, but he rejected them. So this could have been retribution. If you think back to a recent episode I did on Madalina Kojikari's disappearance, her mother also had paranoid delusions about Russians. It might seem odd for this to come up twice, but it actually isn't. Delusions are generally informed by the world around us. Looking at religion is probably the easiest way to see this. Studies of religious delusions within people diagnosed with schizophrenia vary country to country. In Switzerland, it's about 21%. In the US, it's about 50%. And then in Lithuania, it's around 64%. And those numbers largely reflect the religiosity of those countries. So when we look at someone like Madalina Kojikari's mother, Diana, who was a child living in the Soviet Union when it dissolved, and we look at Roy Murry, who served in the U.S. military during our up and down Russian relations, this would be a common source for a delusion. So within the context of Roy telling the police that the Russians may have done this, he was willing to answer some more specific questions about how someone could have gotten onto the Canfield property, even making a map and indicating that a house to the south of them was actually empty at the time. This would have been both an easy place to hide out and somewhere to access the Canfield home undetected. Roy said, in response to questions, that the killer or killers would not have touched the gun cartridges to avoid getting fingerprints on them, and they likely wore gloves. They would have brought everything, including the gas, with them to the scene. So some of the things that Roy said got the investigators' attention because it was true about this case, like the lack of prints on the cartridges. From the shell casings left at the scene, they pulled no fingerprints. And it fit with something Mandy had told them. She said that Roy usually wiped off the rounds before he would load them into his guns so that his prints wouldn't be on them. He told her this was so he could get away from a scene without leaving a trace. He called it shoot and scoot. If my husband talked to me about something like this, I would assume he's planning something terrible and I would call the police. But that's because my husband doesn't do more than go to the firing range with friends once or twice a year. In this case, we have to remember that Roy was a prepper and he was preparing for whatever it is preppers think is going to happen. Roy was always preparing for worst-case scenarios, so talking about a shoot and scoot was, within that context, normal. Everything Roy said about his plans had to do with the upcoming civil unrest or lawlessness or the fall of the government, and so that's how Mandy took it. In the second interview that the police had with Roy, they did ask him about being at the Canfield house the evening after the murders, and he denied it was him, saying that he was with his friend Bobby at the time. And unlike the camping friends whose information Roy wouldn't turn over, he did give them Bobby's information, but did so with the caveat that it was unlikely Bobby would confirm anything. Like Roy and his other friends, Bobby was in the intelligence community and wouldn't work with local cops. Except Bobby did talk to them when the investigators followed up with him. He confirmed that he saw Roy at about 6:30 on the evening of May 26th, and he said he hadn't seen Roy for months at that point, and they chatted a bit, but it's not like they hung out all night. Roy never even got out of his car. Roy told Bobby about the fire and said that the police think he did it. This conversation happened after he spoke with Mandy and with the Lewiston police, but before he spoke with anyone from Spokane County. So he was more assuming they suspected him because they hadn't told him that directly. So the police were able to follow up with Bobby about the alibi from the night after the fire, but the alibi for the actual night of the murders they couldn't find anyone who was camping with Roy. Even without Roy giving them names, they did try to track down any friends who might have been with him that night and found no one. All they had were the phone records that confirmed that Roy, or at least his phone, was in Lewiston when Mandy called, but even that didn't exclude Roy from the suspect list any way you cut it. For one thing, he could have left his phone behind, just like he said he did when he was supposedly camping. Someone so concerned with preparing for the fall of government and avoiding Russian spies would know not to take his phone with him somewhere he didn't want the government to know he went. But even if Roy had his phone with him, the police believed the murders happened around 12:30 for a couple of reasons. For one, John sent a normal text to someone at 12:16 a.m., and so we know nothing was wrong then. But then neighbors reported hearing gunshots around 12:30. Being in a rural area, it wasn't an uncommon sound, so they heard it, they noted it, but they didn't worry about it. As for the fire, a neighbor drove down the street and passed the house at around 1:30 and didn't see anything suspicious, so we know the fire started after that. The call to emergency services was at 2:05 a.m. So Roy and his phone could have made it back to Lewiston by 4:30.
Hi, I'm Cindy Crawford, and I'm the founder of Meaningful Beauty. When Dr. Sabah and I decided to do a skincare line together, he said to me, "We are going to give women meaningful beauty." And I said, "That's exactly right. We want to give women meaningful beauty, which means each and every product is meaningful. It has a reason to exist. It's efficacious. You're going to get results. And then you just go out and live your life."
Meaningful Beauty. Confidence is beautiful. Learn more at meaningfulbeauty.com.
The following ad is sponsored by Pets Best Insurance Services. Your pet is your bestie, your therapist, your preferred match. It's easy to love them, even when they sneak your snacks. It's easy to protect them, too, with pet insurance coverage from Pets Best. Because it's all fun and games until they chew on something they shouldn't. With perfect timing, Pets Best helps protect your furry friend and your budget from this imperfect world. Get up to 90% on eligible vet bills for less than $1 a day. Find your perfect match at PetsBest.com. Pet insurance products offered and administered by Pets Best Insurance Services, LLC are underwritten by American Pet Insurance Company or Independence American Insurance Company. For all terms, visit PetsBest.com/policy.
But let's think about this timeline for a minute. It would be odd for 3 people to be murdered at 12:30 and then a killer to sit around for over an hour before setting the fire and leaving the scene. But the investigators believed that was what happened, and they believed that this timeline pointed right towards Roy. So let's get to their theory of the crime. They believed that Roy was angry after his conversation with Mandy about getting a divorce. Yes, he was the one who brought it up, but her readily agreeing to it wasn't what he wanted to hear. He knew Mandy was heading to work that afternoon because they had to end their conversation so she could go, and he knew about what time she would get home. So at some point after 12:15 or so, when Mandy should be arriving home, Roy approached the house. The breaker box for the house was outside, so he flipped it so that the power went out in Terry and Lisa's bedroom. His hope was to lure Terry out of the house so that he could neutralize the greatest threat to him. It's not clear how, after getting Terry outside, he managed to get him to the outbuilding, but Terry had recently had shoulder surgery and his arm was in a sling, so there wouldn't have been much he could do to fight back if someone pointed a gun at him and ordered him to go somewhere. After killing Terry, and those were probably the shots the neighbors heard, Roy then went into the house and came face to face with Mandy's younger brother, John. Because John had been found on his back, but had a shot to the back of his neck, they believed that John tried to escape the house when Roy first fired at him from behind. After John was down, he was shot again in the front of the neck, in his chest and in his temple. Then Roy turned on Lisa. She was shot twice as many times as the other two, and her body appeared to have been staged afterwards. She was found partly nude at the end of the bed and in a weird position that didn't look like a way she would have naturally fallen. She had also been gagged with a small cloth. The investigators believed that Roy's anger was more directed at Lisa than at Terry or John. He saw her as someone who really interfered with his marriage, the person Mandy leaned on more than anyone else. And according to what he told Mandy and others, he also thought Lisa was a Russian spy. After the three people in the house were dead, Roy waited for the person he hated the most to come home, and that was Mandy. But Mandy had agreed to stay late, so Roy waited and waited until he had no choice but to move ahead with the fire and the cover-up so that he could get back to Lewiston before the morning and before anyone realized he was gone. The police believe that Roy explaining how someone else could have done it was actually an indication of how he did do it, including having brought the gasoline with him. Friends told the police that Roy usually carried full gas cans in his car so that he wouldn't have to stop for gas and the government couldn't track his movements. But when the police searched Roy's car, the gas cans his friends said he had were not there. They did find a pistol in the car, a .22 like the murder weapon, and .22 caliber bullets that were both in his car and in his apartment. They also found wire cutters in his car, which was interesting because the chain that blocked the neighbor's driveway had been cut on the night of the murders. There were also blood stains seen on the driver's seat and the driver's side floor mat, and they also found human blood in Roy's apartment. In addition to searching his house and his car, they also searched his storage unit, and in there, they found road flares similar to what was found at the scene of the fire. 30-year-old Roy Murry was then arrested after his second full interview on May 30th, 2015. The investigators sent all of this evidence to the lab to get ready for trial, and what they got back was bad news after bad news. The .22 was not the murder weapon. The bloodstains didn't match any of the three victims. The road flares, they're widely sold in stores and owned by millions of people. Even Roy's boots, they pulled soil off of them, and the soil did not match the dirt around the Canfield home. Roy's DNA was not found at the scene, and the DNA of the three victims was not found on Roy or any of his belongings. But that's not to say they didn't get any DNA. They found male DNA that was not Roy's on the spout of a gas can left at the scene, and then they found other male DNA, also not Roy's, under Lisa's fingernails. And this one is the big red flag. They tested that DNA against that of a male massage client that Lisa had recently seen, and it wasn't his. They never figured out whose DNA that was. So we have male DNA at the murder scene, under the nails of the victim who we know fought back, but it wasn't the DNA of the man under arrest, and the state did not have a benign explanation for it. When it came to the forensic evidence, they didn't have anything pointing to Roy Murry except one very small thing. And I say very small in a literal sense because we are talking about nanoparticles of a synthetic silicone that was found on the shell casings found at the scene. The way this links to Roy does require a little explaining. Roy was working with someone to develop a commercial bullet lubricant called Accudur. A lubricant can help a bullet move more smoothly with less friction, which helps with accuracy. They were still in the development phase, so this was not yet publicly available, and only 2 vials of it existed. One Roy had, and the other his partner had, which he turned over to the state crime lab when he was asked for it. The partner didn't actually even own firearms, so he never used his sample. So, they found nanoparticles of a compound found in a bullet lubricant that Roy was one of the only people with access to, and the only person with access to it who also had a connection to the Canfields. Even though the rest of the forensic evidence failed them, the state felt the nanoparticles plus the circumstantial case was enough to go to trial with. And prior to the trial, the judge did hold a Frye hearing over the nanoparticle evidence. So at a Frye hearing, the prosecutor has to prove that the scientific community generally accepts the scientific basis for the evidence and that the correct scientific procedures were used. This standard comes from Frye v. the United States, and since we're talking about scientific evidence, it makes us think about forensics. You'd think this case was from the 60s or 70s or 80s, but it wasn't. It was from 1923. James Frye had been convicted of second-degree murder, and he appealed, saying that the judge erred in excluding his expert who could prove he wasn't lying. The science in question was an early polygraph test that measured changes in systolic blood pressure. Frye lost his appeal because the science used in that lie detector test wasn't accepted by the broader scientific community, and this established the basis for admitting scientific evidence in a criminal case. The case happened in the 1920s, but it wasn't really used as precedent until we get into the 70s and 80s, and some courts use a different determination that has 5 points, but in this case, they used the Frye standard, so this is a Frye hearing. The argument the defense made against allowing the nanoparticle evidence wasn't that it wasn't accepted at all, but that it wasn't accepted within forensic science. The state crime lab had used a scanning electron microscope to examine the shell casings and the nanoparticles. The scientist there thought it was from AccuDur, but he wasn't so sure, so he sent it out to a private lab with access to a transmission electron microscope. Using this fancy science equipment, according to court documents, the samples were consistent with the unique component of AccuDur. Though transmission electron microscopes had been used in science for more than 3 decades at this point, the argument the defense was making was that it was not normally used in criminal forensics, which is the application they were using here. But the state had the scientist Roy was working with to make the AccuDur testify, and he said not only had he used this type of microscope in the development, he would use it to tell if someone copied his formula, so the creator of the substance is backing up the process. And with that, the evidence was in when this case went to trial in November of 2016. Because the case was still largely circumstantial, we have a lot of witnesses here to give all the little pieces of the puzzle, and the trial lasted for 4 weeks. The state had Roy's first wife, Erica, testify about his behaviors within their marriage after he got back from Iraq. It was very similar to what Mandy would testify to, including having seen Roy wipe his fingerprints off shell casings. The state also wanted Erica to testify to one thing that the judge did not allow in. Erica said that Roy had threatened her life when she talked about getting a divorce. He said something about how she would die before that happened. And the state wanted to use it to show how Roy reacted to rejection. But the defense successfully argued that even if he did say that, this happened 8 years before the murders and in an entirely different relationship. And when Erica did leave Roy, nothing happened. The state would need something more recent if they wanted to establish a state of mind, and to help with that, they had Roy's friend Michelle testify. Michelle said that Roy had seemed off to her when she talked to him just days before the murders. In fact, little he said made sense. He told her that he was headed towards another divorce and Mandy's family was taking her side, but then Michelle noticed that Roy had cut and dyed his hair, and he was dressed in a different style than usual, and he had lost weight. She was curious about these changes, and Roy's explanation was all about how people were after him and he had to lay low, and he was basically trying to avoid whatever entities were after him. Mandy also testified about Roy's paranoid behavior and delusional belief that she and her mother were Russian spies. She told the jury about how Roy talked about this mental list of people who betrayed him, who he would go after if he could get away with it, but she admitted she didn't know if her family was on it. As for other evidence, the state pointed out that the only thing stolen from the home was the gift that Roy had given Mandy, and then there was testimony about the AccuDur lubricant, including that Roy had tested it using one of his own .22 guns, which was a gun the police never found. The investigators had also done a digital search and found things on Roy's computer that I actually don't think are evidence at all, but apparently the state of Washington disagrees with me. One was that Roy did searches about trioxane, which the military uses in fuel bars, and they did find some of these in his storage unit, and a witness said he had given them some and said they're good for starting fires. But the problem is they didn't find trioxane at the scene, just the road flares. So the link between owning these fire starters and starting the fire is broken, in my view, when they found no trace of that fire starter at the scene. The other digital evidence has to do with some songs that Roy posted less than 24 hours before the murder. He put these songs up on his Facebook page, and the state thought they were somewhat incriminating, but I don't see it. The first was the song Gasolina by Daddy Yankee, and if you're familiar with the actual lyrics, you're probably confused on why they thought this was some sort of clue. One of the first lines in the song can be translated to let them get ready for what's going to hit them. And of course, gasolina means gasoline in Spanish, and gasoline was used in the arson portion of the crime. That said, gasolina is about a young woman who likes to go out and party. It's actually a Puerto Rican idiom. It has nothing to do with actual gasoline, and none of the lyrics do either. Of course, it's possible Roy didn't know what it was about. I did come across some older internet posts in my random research on this case about the meaning of the song, with some people thinking it was actually commentary about oil production and conflicts in the Middle East that the U.S. has gotten into over oil. That's not what the song is about, but for Roy, who not only served but was injured in Iraq, he would have probably connected to that meaning. Another song posted was Face Everything and Rise, which is about facing everything and rising. It's about getting over your pain and the broken world and all that. And then the third song he posted was Revolution, not the Beatles song, but one that includes the lines, "Can you see it? The worst is over. The monsters in my head are scared of love. Fallen people, listen up. It's never time to change your luck." It's literally another song about picking yourself up and moving on. For someone facing a divorce and trying to come to terms with it, yeah, Roy would probably like the song. And this is the thing with trying to assign meaning to someone posting lyrics or a music video online. What the state saw as suspicious just seems normal to me. They had to take lines of these songs fully out of context to make them even sound mildly suspicious. Now, as for the defense, they leaned pretty heavily into the lack of forensic evidence. No match on the murder weapon, no DNA, the fingerprints, soil samples, they had nothing. And what they did have was the presence of another man's DNA under Lisa's fingernails pointing away from Roy. Yes, Roy had gas cans and road flares like what was found at the crime scene, but so did a lot of people. It's not like they were unique or a brand only he had access to. Now, they couldn't argue the same about the Accutor lubricant, though the defense did try to argue that the tests weren't as conclusive as they seemed. The trial lasted 4 weeks, and then the jury took 10 hours to come to their verdict. They found 31-year-old Roy Murray guilty of 3 counts of aggravated murder, 1 count of attempted murder on his ex-wife, and 1 count of arson. At sentencing, Roy chose not to make a statement, and he was then sentenced to life in prison. His attorney said that the government had sent this man to combat where he was injured and suffered PTSD, and then they used the symptoms of that PTSD against him in court, which was something I actually sat with for a while. I do think it's worth parsing out in our own minds what we think about Roy's thinking and behaviors as evidence of murder, and what was just irrelevant but used to paint a picture, possibly unfairly, in court. Roy Murray appealed on several grounds, including that he should have had a competency hearing, and he lost on all points related to the murders. But he won on the attempted murder charge. The state had charged him with attempted murder as the actual charge, when it should have been premeditated attempted murder. The appellate court agreed and threw out the conviction. With that being one of the lesser charges, given that there were 3 aggravated murder convictions that stood, the state just dismissed it. So Roy was resentenced, and again, he got life without parole for the murders, and he got 7 years for the arson. So let's get into these innocence claims, which is how I opened the episode. Roy does have some support in his claims based largely on the lack of forensic evidence linking him to the crime, as well as the suspects that the police didn't even look into since they zeroed in on Roy pretty much immediately. So these other suspects are, according to an article by Edward Snook with the U.S. Observer, I mentioned it at the top of the episode. One was Mandy's brother John Constable's life. He had people who were unsavory in it, though that's about all there is to say about that. If we're going to stick with the investigators' belief that Lisa was the primary target of the 3 who were murdered, maybe they needed to look at her ex-husband and not Mandy's. Their divorce had been settled for a couple of years, and Kelly wasn't even paying spousal support anymore since Lisa had remarried. So it should have all been done and dusted, but in November of 2014, something happened, and Lisa filed a motion asking Kelly for 3 years' worth of financial statements. It turned out there was still some property that hadn't been dealt with from the divorce, and so some things were going to be getting reopened. An order was signed that stopped Kelly from doing anything with the property given to him in the divorce while things got figured out. At this point, Kelly was not doing very well financially, and within a couple of weeks, he filed for bankruptcy. Once you put a bankruptcy on the table, it makes other court proceedings more complicated. Sometimes it even pauses them. So all of this happened 5 months before the murders, so it's pretty safe to say that in May, when the murders occurred, this was all still pending. Something that I think needs to be addressed within this quote-unquote theory is John's murder. No matter how annoyed or angry Kelly was at Lisa or even Terry for the financial dragging on of the divorce, we would have to get past the fact that Kelly lost his son in this as well, and he would have lost his daughter if she hadn't worked late. And I just can't get past that right now. Yes, the police should have thoroughly investigated all angles, but no, I don't think Kelly had anything to do with this. I think Roy's innocence claims should focus on the DNA under Lisa's fingernails. What-ifs don't work with appeals because the presumption of innocence is gone. Roy Murry walks into that court now with a presumption of guilt, and he has to prove otherwise. So he needs to focus on the evidence that would prove that, and not just theories of who had beef with who. I personally would like to know who that DNA belongs to. I would like to find out if there's a benign explanation. If you remember back to the 2-parter I did in February of 2024 on the murder of Carol Kennedy, they found male DNA that didn't match their suspect. But someone had the idea to test the DNA of the person who was autopsied before her, and it turned out to be his DNA. But he couldn't be the killer because he died before she did. It was simply the ME or a tech just not washing something well enough and transferring the DNA. I would like to know if it was something like that, because I'm never comfortable with unknown DNA at a scene. And not really at the scene, because there was DNA on the gas spout, and I'm not worried about that. That could have gotten there 100 different ways. But under Lisa's fingernails, when we know she had defensive wounds, I would like an explanation because it would give me more confidence in the conviction. And I say more confidence because even though I went into this with the context of this being a possible wrongful conviction, I lean towards Roy Murry being guilty. But as long as that unmatched DNA is there, particularly since they found none of Roy's DNA, I will always hold just a little doubt. Is it a reasonable doubt? No, but it is a little doubt. It is time for November birthday shoutouts, and I just love the month of November. I like the change of the weather. Even though I don't really love to be cold, I like to anticipate the cold and the coziness. I love doing Thanksgiving dinner. It just feels like it's a ramp up to the holidays, and it's just a wonderful month. So with that, I do have a special place in my heart for November and for my November Patreon supporters. So I want to say a very happy birthday to Megan, Rendar, Raquel, Ender, Bree, Jamie, Allie, Justine, Jackie, Gail, Marie, Susan, AR, Preeti, and Anna. I hope you had an amazing birthday month, as I'm getting this done at the very end of the month. But since you're getting the shout out so late, I feel like you get an extra month extension on your birthday celebration. So this should carry you well through December. So to my Patreon supporters with November birthdays, I want to say happy birthday.